The air was thick with anticipation as the students of Sunshine Secondary School filed into their classrooms. The rustling of exercise books and the hum of whispered conversations filled the air. Sunshine was an ordinary school in the bustling city of Lagos, but hidden beneath its facade were secrets dark enough to cloud the brightest skies. This was the day when one such secret would unravel. Amaka, a shy but intelligent 13-year-old junior high school girl, clutched her books tightly as she hurried to her class. She had always loved learning, but today her enthusiasm was dampened by an inexplicable feeling of unease. The principal, Mr. Adderwale, a man in his late 50s with an aura of authority, had summoned her to his office during the first break. Amaka had no idea why, but the thought of sitting alone in his office made her stomach churn. Rumors about the principal's strange behavior toward some girls had circulated among the students, but no one dared to confront or even speak too loudly about it. When the bell rang for break, Amaka hesitated at her desk. Her best friend, Tolu, noticed her reluctance. "Amaka, what's wrong? You've barely touched your food," Tolu asked, her voice tinged with concern. "The principal asked to see me," Amaka replied, her voice barely audible. Tolu's eyes widened. "Do you know why?" Amaka shook her head. "No, but I feel strange about it." "You'll be fine," Tolu said, trying to reassure her, but the worry in her eyes betrayed her words. Amaka nodded hesitantly and made her way to the principal's office. The corridor leading to the office was eerily quiet, the sound of her footsteps echoing against the tiled floor. She paused at the door, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Taking a deep breath, she knocked. "Come in," a deep voice commanded. Amaka opened the door and stepped inside. Mr. Adderwale sat behind his large mahogany desk, his piercing eyes fixed on her. He smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Good afternoon, sir," Amaka greeted, clutching her books tightly. "Good afternoon, Amaka." "Please have a seat," he said, gesturing to the chair in front of his desk. Amaka sat down, her heart pounding. The office was stiflingly hot, despite the air conditioner humming in the background. Mr. Adderwale leaned back in his chair, his gaze lingering on her for a moment too long. "I've heard good things about you," he began, his tone unusually soft. "Your teachers say you're one of the brightest students in your class." "Thank you, sir," Amaka replied, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, then leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "You know, Amaka, I take special interest in students like you, students with great potential. I like to mentor them." Amaka shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Something about his tone made her skin crawl. Before she could respond, there was a knock at the door. Both of them turned toward the sound. Mr. Adderwale's expression darkened for a split second before he composed himself. "Who is it?" he barked. The door creaked open, and Chaik, a senior student, peeked inside. "Sorry to disturb, sir. I was sent to collect the attendance register." Mr. Adderwale's jaw tightened, but he forced a smile. "I'll bring it to you later. Close the door." Chaik hesitated, his eyes darting between Amaka and the principal. Something in the room felt off, but he didn't dare question it. "Yes, sir," he muttered, closing the door behind him. The interruption seemed to rattle Mr. Adderwale. He stood up and walked around the desk, his movements slow and deliberate. Amaka's pulse quickened as he approached her. She glanced at the door, calculating how quickly she could reach it if she needed to. "You're very special, Amaka," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to help you succeed, but you have to trust me. Can you do that?" Before Amaka could answer, the door burst open. It was Chaik again, his face flushed. "Sir, the vice principal is looking for you," he said hurriedly. Mr. Adderwale froze, his expression a mix of anger and panic. He straightened up, adjusting his tie. "I'll be there shortly," he said, his voice strained. Chaik nodded, but his eyes lingered on Amaka for a moment before he left. As the door closed, Mr. Adderwale turned back to her, his demeanor shifting. "You may go for now, Amaka. We'll continue this discussion later." Amaka didn't need to be told twice. She bolted out of the office, her heart racing. She didn't stop until she was back in her classroom, where Tolu was waiting for her. "What happened?" Tolu asked, alarmed by the look on her friend's face. Amaka shook her head, too shaken to speak. But Cheek, who had witnessed enough to raise his suspicions, decided it was time to dig deeper. Something was terribly wrong in Sunshine Secondary School, and he wasn't going to let it go unnoticed this time. Amaka's return to the classroom left her shaken, but she tried to keep her composure. She sat silently at her desk, her mind racing with confusion and fear. Tolu leaned closer, whispering, "Amaka, what happened? You look pale." Amaka hesitated. She didn't know how to put her feelings into words. I don't know," she finally said, her voice trembling. "He just talked to me, but it didn't feel right." Tolu frowned but decided not to push further, sensing her friend's discomfort. Across the school, however, Cheek couldn't shake the unease that had gripped him since he interrupted the meeting. He had heard rumors, just like everyone else, but now he had seen something. A flicker of panic in the principal's eyes that confirmed the whispers were more than idle gossip. Later that day, during lunch break, Cheek confided in his closest friend, Kingsley. They sat under a mango tree in the far corner of the schoolyard, away from prying ears. "Kingsley, something's off about the principal," Cheek began, keeping his voice low. "I think he's been doing things to some of the girls." Kingsley raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" Cheek explained what he had seen in the principal's office earlier. Kingsley listened intently, his expression growing darker with every word. "You know this isn't something you can just accuse him of without proof," Kingsley warned. "He's powerful. People like him can ruin lives if you challenge them." "I know," Cheek replied, his jaw tightening, "but I can't ignore this. What if he's done it before? What if he's still doing it? Someone has to stop him." Kingsley sighed, torn between his loyalty to his friend and the fear of the consequences. "If you're serious about this, we need evidence, otherwise no one will believe us." Meanwhile, Amaka couldn't focus during her afternoon classes. The principal's words replayed in her mind, each one tinged with an unsettling undertone she couldn't quite articulate. As the final bell rang, she packed her bag slowly, hoping to avoid crossing paths with Mr. Addiwale again. As she stepped out of the classroom, she saw Cheek waiting near the entrance. He approached her cautiously. "Amaka, can I talk to you?" She hesitated but nodded. They moved to a quieter spot near the school's water tank. Cheek looked around to ensure no one was listening before he spoke. "What happened in the principal's office today?" he asked. Amaka's eyes darted to the ground. "Nothing. He just said he wanted to mentor me." Cheek frowned. "Did he touch you? Say anything inappropriate?" Amaka shook her head quickly, but her hands were trembling. "No. But it didn't feel right. I don't know how to explain it." Cheek placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone, Amaka. If something happens, you can tell me. I'll make sure it doesn't go unnoticed." Amaka nodded, but the fear in her eyes lingered. Cheek decided then and there that he wouldn't wait for something worse to happen. He needed to uncover the truth, even if it meant putting himself at risk. Over the next few days, Cheek began observing the principal more closely. He noticed how Mr. Addiwale often lingered around the junior classes, his eyes scanning the students in a way that made Cheek's stomach turn. He also noticed that certain girls seemed unusually quiet and withdrawn after being summoned to the principal's office. One afternoon, Cheek overheard two junior girls whispering in the corner of the school library. He caught snippets of their conversation, something about feeling trapped and being scared to tell anyone. When they noticed him, they quickly fell silent and hurried away. Cheek's frustration grew. He needed solid proof, but how could he get it? He couldn't just burst into the principal's office with accusations. That would only backfire. Then an idea struck him. He remembered that the principal often left his office unlocked when he stepped out for meetings. If he could access any incriminating files, or perhaps even the security camera footage from the school premises, it might provide the evidence he needed. That Friday, during the afternoon assembly, Cheek slipped away unnoticed. The principal was busy addressing the students, which gave Cheek a narrow window of opportunity. He crept towards the administrative block, his heart pounding with each step. When he reached the principal's office, he tried the door handle. It was locked. His heart sank, but just as he was about to turn back, he remembered something. Mr. Adderwale often kept a spare key hidden under the potted plant outside the office. Chike crouched down and felt under the pot. His fingers brushed against cold metal. Bingo. He inserted the key into the lock and turned it slowly, wincing at the faint click. The door swung open, revealing the dimly lit office. He slipped inside and closed the door behind him. The room was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the air conditioner. Cheek scanned the desk, searching for anything that might be useful. He opened drawers, flipped through files, and checked the computer monitor, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Just as he was about to give up, his eyes landed on a small locked drawer at the bottom of the desk. His pulse quickened. He rummaged through the desk drawers again and found a small key tucked away beneath a stack of papers. It fit the lock perfectly. The drawer creaked open, revealing a stack of envelopes and a flash drive. Cheek grabbed the flash drive and stuffed it into his pocket. He was about to examine the envelopes when he heard voices outside the door. His blood ran cold. Someone was coming. Panicking, he closed the drawer and locked it, quickly returning the spare key to its hiding spot. He pressed himself against the wall as footsteps approached the office. The door handle jiggled and Cheek held his breath, praying he wouldn't be caught. After a few agonizing seconds, the footsteps retreated. Cheek waited until the coast was clear before slipping out of the office and hurrying back to the assembly. His heart was still racing, but he felt a glimmer of hope. Whatever was on that flash drive might hold the answers he was looking for. But little did Cheek know, his actions had not gone unnoticed. Someone had seen him enter the principal's office, and the consequences of his discovery were about to spiral far beyond anything he could have imagined. As the assembly ended, Cheek slipped back into the crowd, trying to appear inconspicuous. His mind raced with thoughts of the flash drive burning a hole in his pocket. What secrets could it hold? He knew he couldn't check it at school, it was too risky. He'd have to wait until he got home. After school, Cheek avoided lingering with friends as he usually did. He told Kingsley he wasn't feeling well and hurried home. Locking himself in his room, he booted up his old laptop and inserted the flash drive. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a folder popped up, labeled Private. Chike's heart pounded as he clicked it open. Inside were several subfolders, each labeled with a different year. He chose the most recent one. Within it were video files, their titles cryptic but numbered sequentially. He hesitated, his finger hovering over the trackpad. A part of him wasn't sure he wanted to see what was on these files. But he reminded himself of why he was doing this. For Amaka, for the other girls, for the truth. He double-clicked the first file. The screen flickered, and a grainy video began to play. The camera seemed to be hidden, its angle low and slightly tilted. Cheek's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the setting. It was the principal's office. In the footage, Mr. Adderwale was seated behind his desk, speaking to a young girl. She looked nervous, her hands fidgeting in her lap. The sound quality was poor, but Cheek could make out fragments of the conversation. The principal's tone was soft, almost fatherly, but there was an undercurrent of manipulation. The next video was worse. This time, the girl looked even younger. Mr. Adderwale was no longer behind his desk. He stood closer to the girl, his posture looming. Cheek's stomach churned as he watched the man place a hand on the girl's shoulder. She flinched but didn't pull away, her fear palpable even through the screen. Chike couldn't watch anymore. He closed the folder and leaned back, his hands trembling. There was no doubt now. Mr. Adderwale was guilty, and these videos were the proof. But what could he do with them? If he went to the authorities, would they believe him? Would they dismiss it as a fabricated attempt to tarnish the principal's reputation? The fear of being discredited weighed heavily on Chika. He knew how powerful Mr. Adderwale was and how much influence he wielded in the community. Still, he couldn't let this go. He decided he needed help, someone older, someone who could guide him. His first thought was his elder sister, Ada. She was in her second year at university and had always been a voice of reason in his life. That night, after dinner, Cheek waited for his parents to go to bed before sneaking into Ada's room. She was sitting on her bed, scrolling through her phone, when Cheek entered. "What are you doing here so late?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "I need to talk to you," Cheek said, closing the door behind him. "It's serious." Ada sat up, her expression shifting to concern. "What's wrong?" Cheek hesitated for a moment before pulling out the flash drive. "It's about our principal. I found something bad." Ada listened intently as Cheek recounted everything, the rumors, Amaka's experience, and his own investigation. When he finished, she stared at him in disbelief. "Chika, do you realize how dangerous this is?" she asked. "If anyone finds out you took that flash drive." "I know," Cheek said, his voice firm, "but I couldn't just stand by. I needed to do something." Ada sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Let me see what's on it." Reluctantly, Cheek handed her the flash drive. Ada plugged it into her laptop and opened the same folder. She watched the first video, her expression hardening with every passing second. When it ended, she closed the file and looked at Cheek. "This is serious," she said, her tone grave. "You were right to bring this to me. But we can't handle this on our own. We need to involve someone who can do something about it." "Like who?" Cheek asked. "The police?" Ada shook her head. "The police might not take us seriously without more context. We need to find an adult in the school, someone trustworthy, maybe the vice principal or one of the senior teachers." Cheek hesitated. The thought of trusting anyone at the school made him uneasy. But he knew Ada was right. They couldn't do this alone. The next morning, Ada accompanied Cheek to school, pretending she was there to pick up some documents for their parents. While Cheek attended his classes, Ada sought out Mrs. Okoro, the vice principal. Mrs. Okoro was known for her no-nonsense attitude and her dedication to the students. If anyone would take them seriously, it was her. When Ada explained the situation, carefully omitting certain details to protect Chike, Mrs. Okoro's face darkened. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice low. Ada nodded. "I have the evidence, but we need to act quickly before he realizes something is missing." Mrs. Okoro agreed to meet Ada and Chika after school to review the evidence. That afternoon, in a secluded corner of the school library, the three of them watched the videos together. By the end, Mrs. Okoro was visibly shaken. This is monstrous," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "He's been preying on these girls, right under our noses." "What do we do now?" Cheek asked. "We need to take this to the school board immediately," Mrs. Okoro replied, "but we have to be cautious. If he finds out, he'll try to cover his tracks." Unbeknownst to them, Mr. Adderwale had already started to suspect something was amiss. That evening, he noticed the spare key to his office was slightly out of place. His paranoia grew when he overheard whispers among the staff about unusual activity in the administrative block. Determined to protect himself, he began devising a plan to discredit anyone who might challenge him. The stakes were rising, and Chika, Ada, and Mrs. Okoro were running out of time. The truth was within their grasp, but exposing it would come at a cost, one they weren't yet prepared to face. The days that followed were filled with tension. Chike couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every time he walked through the school gates, he half expected someone to confront him, to ask why he had been snooping around the principal's office. Ada was just as uneasy, often reminding him to be cautious, to be careful about who they trusted. But despite the mounting fear, they both knew they couldn't back down. The meeting with Mrs. Okoro was set for the following week, and she had promised to help them navigate the dangerous waters of exposing Mr. Adderwale. But before they could take action, the principal made an unexpected move. One morning, as Cheek walked into school, he was pulled aside by one of the senior teachers, Mr. Olaronfemi. A tall, broad-shouldered man, Mr. Olaronfemi had always been friendly to Chike, but today his demeanor was different. "Chike," Mr. Olaronfemi said, his voice calm but serious, "I need to speak with you for a moment. It's about something I overheard." Chike's stomach dropped. The teacher's tone was far too serious, and the last thing he wanted was to attract attention to his investigation. "What is it, sir?" "Let's step into the staff room," Mr. Olaronfemi said, motioning toward the corridor. The two of them walked in silence, the air growing thicker with every step. When they reached the staff room, Mr. Olaronfemi shut the door behind them. "Now, Chike," he began, sitting down across from him. "I don't want to alarm you, but I have my suspicions. There's been talk around the school. Some of the students have been whispering about you. They say you've been asking questions about the principal." Chaik froze. Had someone seen him enter the office? Had someone heard him talking to Ada? "I don't know what you're talking about, sir," he lied, his voice steady, despite the panic rising in his chest. Mr. Olorunfemi's gaze was piercing, and Chaik could sense he wasn't buying the lie. "I've been teaching here for years, Chaik. I know when something's not right. The principal has been acting strangely lately. I'm sure you've noticed." Chaik swallowed. Mr. Olorunfemi's words hit too close to home. "What are you suggesting, sir?" "Look," the teacher said, leaning forward, "I've been keeping an eye on things too. I've seen how the principal behaves with certain students. You're not the only one who's concerned. But this is bigger than just one student. If you're going to do something about it, you'll need to be careful. Mr. Adawale has a lot of influence in this school. He's not someone you can confront openly." Chaik's heart pounded. Was Mr. Olorunfemi trying to warn him, or was he trying to get him to back off? "Why are you telling me this?" Chaik asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The teacher hesitated before answering. "I've seen the way he looks at the girls, Chaik. I'm not blind. But if you have evidence, if you can prove it, then maybe, just maybe, we can do something. But you'll need allies. You won't be able to fight him alone." Chaik nodded slowly, his mind racing. The truth was closer than ever, but so were the dangers. How could he trust anyone? Was Mr. Olorunfemi genuinely trying to help, or was he just another pawn in Mr. Adawale's game? Later that day, Chika met with Ada and Mrs. Okoro in a quiet corner of the school library. He told them about the conversation with Mr. Olorunfemi, and both of them seemed concerned, though for different reasons. Ada was wary of trusting the teacher completely, but Mrs. Okoro's instincts told her that Olorunfemi was genuine. He had been at the school for years, and if he was really as concerned as he seemed, he could be a powerful ally. "We need to be smart about this," Mrs. Okoro said, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. "The more people who know, the more dangerous it becomes. If we're going to expose him, we need to do it carefully." Chaik felt a weight on his shoulders. He had never imagined that something so serious would happen to him. He was just a student, just a boy who wanted to make sure that justice was served. But now he was in the middle of something far larger than himself. "We need to make a plan," Cheek said, his voice firm. "We can't let him get away with this." Mrs. Okoro nodded, and they spent the next hour discussing their options. Cheek, despite his fear, felt a spark of hope. They could do this. They could stop Mr. Adawale before he hurt anyone else. However, as the conversation came to a close, Chaik's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. It was a message from Kingsley. "Chaik, where are you? I just saw something. I think you need to see this." Chaik's stomach dropped. He quickly typed a reply, telling Kingsley to meet him at the usual spot after school. He didn't know what his friend had seen, but it was clear that something else was happening, something he wasn't aware of. That afternoon, as the final bell rang, Cheek met Kingsley outside the school gates. His friend looked out of breath, his face pale. "What's going on?" Cheek asked, his heart pounding. I saw the principal," Kingsley gasped. "I saw him with one of the girls from your class. It was after school when everyone was leaving. They were in the hallway, and the way he was talking to her... It was wrong, Cheek. It was worse than what you said." Chaik felt a chill run down his spine. "Where were they? What happened?" Kingsley swallowed hard. "They were by the janitor's closet. I didn't get too close, but I saw enough. He was too close to her. I think he was trying to do something, but then someone walked by, and they both quickly left. I don't know what it was, but it didn't look good." Chaik's mind raced. Was Mr. Adawale escalating? Was he becoming more brazen, knowing that students were starting to talk? "I need to go talk to Mrs. Okoro," Cheek said, determination in his voice. "This can't wait any longer." But just as he turned to leave, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Across the street, just outside the school gate, was Mr. Adawale, standing in the shadows. He was watching them. Chaik froze. Had the principal known they were plotting against him? Was he aware of their plans? And what would happen if he came after them next? The danger was closing in, and there was no turning back now. Chike's pulse quickened as he locked eyes with Mr. Addywale. The principal was standing at the edge of the street, barely visible under the fading light of the afternoon sun. His expression was unreadable, but the way he was staring, cold, calculating, sent a wave of dread crashing over Chike. Kingsley, noticing his friend's stiff posture, followed his gaze. When he saw the principal, he instinctively stepped closer to Chike. "What's going on?" he whispered. Chike didn't answer immediately. His mind was racing. There was no way Mr. Addywale could have known what they were planning. Was there? Could someone have tipped him off? Or was he just watching them because he had been suspicious for days? "Let's get out of here," Chike said, his voice low. "Now." Kingsley nodded, and together they began to walk away, trying to blend in with the other students leaving for the day. But as they turned a corner and made their way down a quiet side street, Chike couldn't shake the feeling that something was following them. He glanced over his shoulder. The street was empty. Still, the unease gnawed at him. It wasn't just paranoia. He knew that the principal had his eyes on them now. When they reached Kingsley's house, Chike immediately pulled out his phone and called Mrs. Okoro. The vice principal answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Okoro," Chike said, his voice urgent, "I think the principal knows we're onto him. I just saw him outside the school gate, watching me and Kingsley." Mrs. Okoro's voice was steady, but Chike could hear the concern beneath it. "We need to act fast. It sounds like he's becoming aware of your investigation, Chike. This changes everything." Chike's heart sank. He had known things were getting dangerous, but the stakes had just been raised. He couldn't back down now. He had seen too much. He had evidence. "I've got the flash drive," Chike said, looking at it lying on the table in front of him. "What should we do next?" "Meet me at my house," Mrs. Okoro said. "We need to come up with a plan, and I'll help you figure out how to expose him safely, but we have to move quickly." Chike ended the call and turned to Kingsley. "We need to go see Mrs. Okoro right now." "I'll drive," Kingsley offered, grabbing his keys. The ride to Mrs. Okoro's house was tense. Chike kept looking over his shoulder, expecting someone to follow them. Kingsley kept his eyes on the road, his grip tight on the steering wheel. Neither of them spoke much, the weight of the situation hanging over them. When they arrived, Mrs. Okoro greeted them at the door with a grim expression. She led them into the living room, where the three of them sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation sinking in. "I've been thinking," Mrs. Okoro began, her voice calm but firm, "and I believe we need to go straight to the school board. The principal is too dangerous. We can't keep handling this ourselves. If we take it to the board, we can get the authorities involved and start a formal investigation." "But what if he finds out we've gone to the board?" Chike asked. "What if he tries to cover his tracks before we can get the evidence out there?" "That's a risk we have to take," Mrs. Okoro replied. "But we need to make sure we're prepared. We can't wait any longer. He's already becoming more desperate." Chike nodded. "We'll go to the board, but first I need to tell Amaka what's going on. She has to know." Mrs. Okoro agreed, and after a few more discussions, they made their plan. The next morning, Chike met Aramaka before school. She was waiting by the school gate, and when she saw Chike, she ran up to him. "Chike, what's happening?" she asked, her face filled with anxiety. "I haven't seen you in days. I heard rumors that the principal's been looking for you." "I need to tell you something," Chike said, his voice serious. "It's about Mr. Addywale." Amaka's face went pale. "I knew something wasn't right. What's going on, Chike?" Chike took a deep breath and told her everything. He explained about the flash drive, the evidence they had uncovered, and how they were planning to take it to the school board. Amaka listened in silence, her eyes wide with shock, but she didn't interrupt. When Chike finished, Amaka's voice trembled. "But what if he finds out? What if he comes after us?" Chike placed a hand on her shoulder. "We're not going to let him get away with it. We have the truth, and that's all that matters." That afternoon, the plan was set into motion. Chike, Amaka, Kingsley, and Mrs. Okoro met with the school board. The room was tense, and as they explained the situation, Chike felt the weight of their words sink in. The board members listened carefully, their faces growing more and more concerned as they watched the videos and read through the evidence. When it was over, one of the senior members, a stern-looking man named Mr. Ikenna, stood up. "This is a serious accusation," he said, his voice low. "If these allegations are true, Mr. Adewale will be removed from his position immediately. But we need to involve the authorities. This is beyond the scope of the school." Chike nodded. He knew the road ahead would be difficult. Mr. Adewale was powerful, and the school board's decision might not be the end of it. The principal had friends in high places, people who could try to silence them. But it didn't matter. The truth had to come out. It was no longer just about protecting themselves or even just exposing the principal's wrongdoings. It was about ensuring that no more students would fall victim to his manipulation. The police were called, and within days a formal investigation was launched. Mr. Adewale was placed under suspicion, and his actions were scrutinized thoroughly. As the investigation unfolded, more victims came forward, some of whom had kept quiet for years, afraid of the principal's power and influence. Despite his efforts to deny the accusations, Mr. Adewale was eventually arrested. The truth, once hidden in the shadows, was finally brought to light. The school community was shaken to its core, but they slowly began to heal. The students who had suffered in silence found their voices, and the principal's reign of fear came to an end. Chike, Ada, Kingsley, and Mrs. Okoro watched as the investigation unfolded, relieved that they had done the right thing. They knew the journey ahead wasn't easy, and there would be consequences to face. But they also knew that justice had been served, and they had done what was necessary to protect others. And as Cheek looked back on everything that had happened, on the fear, the uncertainty, and the danger he had faced, he knew one thing for sure. The fight for truth was never easy, but it was always worth it. The weeks following Mr. Adewale's arrest were a blur of media attention, public outrage, and legal proceedings. The story of his abuse spread like wildfire across the country, making headlines in newspapers and news broadcasts. The school community, shaken to its core, struggled to process what had happened under their very noses. Many teachers and students had never suspected the principal, while others had turned a blind eye, unwilling to confront the darkness lurking within the school's walls. But despite the shock, there was a sense of justice in the air. The truth had come to light, and the wheels of justice were in motion. The victims, both the ones who had come forward and those who had remained silent for so long, were finally given the chance to heal. Therapy sessions were made available for the students affected by Mr. Adewale's actions, and the school's leadership was overhauled, with new administrators appointed to ensure that such a betrayal of trust could never happen again. Chike, though he had played a pivotal role in exposing the principal's crimes, found himself struggling with the weight of it all. The emotional toll of what he had uncovered and how far he had gone to reveal the truth left him feeling exhausted. He had done the right thing, but the journey had changed him in ways he hadn't expected. He would never be the same naive 13-year-old boy who had first walked into the school gates with dreams of finishing his education without drama. Ada noticed the change in her brother. The once carefree boy had become more introspective, sometimes staring out the window for long stretches, his thoughts far away. She did her best to support him, always offering a listening ear whenever he needed to talk. Slowly, Cheek began to find peace again. He had done something monumental, something that would impact the school for years to come. The scars left by the ordeal would take time to heal. The trust that had been shattered would need to be rebuilt, but Cheek knew that despite everything, they had won. They had fought for justice, for the truth, and for the dignity of the students who had been betrayed. And in the end, that was all that mattered. One afternoon, several months after the arrest, Cheek stood outside the school gates once more. The place felt different now. There was a sense of hope in the air that hadn't been there before. The students who passed him were no longer whispering in fear or secrecy. They were laughing, talking openly, living their lives without the looming shadow of the principal's control. Cheek smiled to himself. His fight had been worth it. The school would never be the same, but that was okay. Sometimes it took shaking things up, exposing the darkness to bring about change. And as he walked away from the school that day, Cheek knew he had done more than just expose a corrupt man. He had helped change a system, protected the vulnerable, and ensured that no one else would have to endure the same terror that Amaka and the others had suffered. It was a hard-earned victory, one that would stay with him for the rest of his life, but it was one that he could be proud of. And with that, Chica's chapter at that school closed, and he walked forward into his future, stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Please kindly like, comment, subscribe, and share if you have come this far. Thank you very much.